Welcome to Chapter 3. In this chapter, we'll take a look at how strategy determines decisions about everything, including information systems. The goal of this chapter is to help us know how important it is to understand our employer's competitive strategy and to pay attention to that strategy in everything we do. Our study questions for this chapter are 1. What 5 forces determine industry structure? And 2. What is competitive strategy? 3. How does competitive strategy determine value chain structure? And 4. How do value chains determine information systems requirements? Question 5 is how do organizations achieve competitive advantages? Question 1. What 5 forces determine industry structure? Porter's 5-force model consists of 5 of these forces. Taken together, these 5 forces determine industry structure. There are 3 competitive sources and 2 bargaining power sources. The 3 competitive forces in Porter's model concern the danger of customers taking their business elsewhere. Competitive force number 1 is competition from vendors who manufacture substitutes. As an example, let's think about butter and margarine. For some people, butter and margarine are substitutes. Other examples are Crest and Colgate toothpaste, or coal and petroleum, or Uber and Lyft. When substitutes are readily available, there's a greater danger of customers taking their business elsewhere. This is also true when there's high competition from new competitors, the second of the 5 forces in Porter's model. In restaurants which serve food and booze, the the threat of new competitors is high. With airlines, for example, or phone companies, the threat of new competitors is low. It's much easier for a restaurant to pop up than an airline or a phone company. Or how about competition from existing rivals? Think of Pepsi versus Coke. These are 2 competitors that are both competing with each other. So we could say that for Pepsi, this competitive force, the competition from existing rivals, is high because Coke is such a massive brand. The last 2 forces in Porter's model are bargaining power forces. The bargaining power forces actually depend on how many rival products are available and the switching cost, that is, how difficult it is to switch to another vendor. If there aren't many rival products available, then the bargaining power of a customer is weak. And the bargaining power of suppliers is strong, because after all, where else are you going to take your business? There aren't many rival products out there. Let's talk through several quick examples. The bargaining power of suppliers. De Beers owns a large amount of, does anyone know? The world's diamond supply. They have very strong bargaining power because there aren't many rivals. Same with rare paintings, or ARM, which is a software design company that produces a processor that's in almost all, over 90% of the world's smartphones, including iPhones, iPads, Kindles, and Android devices. These suppliers have strong bargaining power. What about the bargaining power of customers? Well, let's ask ourselves a question. Would the bargaining power of customers be strong or weak at a farmer's market? Remember, the availability of substitutes plays a role in determining the bargaining power of customers and suppliers. At a farmer's market, there are usually lots of substitutes available. If you don't like the cucumbers at one stand, then you can move on to a stand nearby. So at a farmer's market, the bargaining power of customers is actually pretty strong. Here are some more examples from our book of Porter's 5 forces. the bargaining power of customers is strong in Toyota's purchase of auto paint. If people don't want lime green cars, then Toyota won't really produce lime green cars. So the bargaining power of customers is pretty high there. An example of the weak bargaining force for customers would be our power and procedures over the policies of our university. We don't, as students, really have much say in how much tuition is, for example. What about the threat of substitutions? Well, this force is strong in a frequent traveler's choice of auto rental. You might have landed in an airport and seen Hertz right next to Avis, right next to Enterprise. So the threat of substitutions is high there. What about a weak force? Well, what about a very specialized type of pharmaceutical where there's only one available? Well, then the threat of substitutions, excuse me, I think I might need some cough syrup, is weak. Okay, what about a strong force? The bargaining power of suppliers is strong when someone is purchasing gasoline. If we don't really like the price of gasoline, yeah, there are some cheaper options out there, but really we need that gasoline to get around if we're a student or if we're a worker. So really the bargaining power of suppliers is pretty high there. We can't do without gasoline. What about grain farmers in a surplus year? Well, this is an example of a weak force of the bargaining power of suppliers, kind of like our farmers market example, but this one's even more extreme. In a surplus, there's more supply of grain than people even want, so it's hard to push this extra grain and clear out the market in that surplus year. So even a low price will not be enough to clear out the market. So those grain suppliers, unfortunately, have a pretty weak bargaining power. How about the force of the threat of new entrants? Well, this force is strong if we consider a corner latte stand. It's fairly easy to open a corner latte stand. You would need I think a business license, of course, and I think some certification to serve beverages. But really, there's not a whole lot that goes into setting up a corner latte stand, or people would say that there are low barriers to entry. In terms of the threat of new entrants for a professional football team, well, that's not very high, right? The threat of new entrants, if you're a professional football team, I don't know when the last professional football team, was formed, but really, there aren't a lot of new entrants into the NFL, the National Football League. And in terms of rivalry, the last of Porter's 5 forces, an example of a strong force, if you've ever been to Mile of Cars, you know this, used car dealers. There are a lot of existing rivals. What about the IRS? Well, no rivals for the IRS, really. They're the one and only agency doing that particular service. So the threat of rivalry is weak for the IRS. Now let's work through some examples of our own. Is the bargaining power of customers strong or weak if we are bargaining to get lower prices with SDG&E? How about if we're bargaining to get lower prices at a farmer's market? Well, the bargaining power of customers is weak if we're bargaining to get lower prices with SDG&E. There's really no rivals out there, no available substitutes. We have to go with them, and if we call them and say my electric bill was really high, can you lower it? Chances are they won't really be able to do that, or they won't agree to do that. The bargaining power of customers, however, is pretty strong if we're bargaining to get lower prices at a farmer's market, kind of for the same reasons that there are lots of substitutes available, and when there are lots of substitutes available, it's easier as a customer to bargain to get lower prices. Okay, let's move on to another example. Here's the answers to the last one, just in the order where they belong. Can we organize this one into the correct order? So the force of the threat of substitutions. Which is strong and which is weak? Major League Baseball or the coal industry? Well, let's think, how many substitutions are there to Major League Baseball? It kind of depends on what you would consider a substitution, but really it's kind of the only game in town. In terms of the coal industry, and maybe this is a little unclear, maybe it'd be clearer to just say energy, so that we would know, okay, the threat of substitutions actually to coal, well, there are other, there's natural gas and there are other, and there's solar, and there are other means of producing energy. So there are more substitutions. If we're considering energy, probably would have been better to just say energy over here instead of focusing on one specific, but okay, let's move on. The bargaining power of suppliers. When is this force strong and when is it weak? A rare art vendor or a street food vendor? So for which of these vendors is the bargaining power of suppliers strong? And the supplier would be the vendor. So if we're selling rare art, we actually have pretty strong bargaining power. If we're the supplier, we have pretty strong bargaining power because there's only one of this, particular rare painting. If we're a street food vendor, probably have weak bargaining power as a supplier. We mentioned this one, but the threat of new entrants. When is that force strong and when is it weak? In the food and booze industry or the airlines industry? Well, the threat of new entrants is strong in the food and booze industry because there are low barriers to entry. In other words, it doesn't take a lot to get a food and booze establishment up and running. In terms of the airlines industry, very high barriers to entry, so a low threat of new entrants. And here are the answers to that last question. And how about in terms of rivalry? When is the force of rivalry strong and when is it weak? In the market for diamonds or the market for toothpaste? Well, we said De Beers owns the majority of the supply of diamonds, so there is not a strong threat of rivalry in the diamond market. In the toothpaste market, there are lots of different suppliers, and so the market's composed of all sorts of different types of toothpaste, Crest and Colgate and Sensodyne and so on. And so the toothpaste market has a stronger threat of rivalry. And here are the answers to that last question. Question 2, what is competitive strategy? Organizations analyze the structure of their industry and use that analysis to formulate a competitive strategy. That's a long-term plan to get ahead or be profitable in the industry. An organization can choose to either minimize cost or maximize differentiation to gain a competitive advantage. Minimizing cost just means being the low-cost provider for a particular good or service. Maximizing uniqueness means providing a better product or service. This leads to the first of the two decisions in an organization's competitive strategy, whether to minimize cost or maximize uniqueness. In other words, differentiate their product. So cost versus differentiation is one of the dimensions of a competitive strategy. The second dimension in the competitive strategy is whether to target a specific subset of consumers in the industry or target the industry as a whole. Targeting a specific subset of consumers is known as a focus strategy, and targeting the industry as a whole is known as a industry-wide strategy. So we end up with four possible competitive strategies. Cost, a low-cost industry-wide strategy would be to provide the lowest cost across the industry. A differentiated industry-wide strategy would be to provide a better product or service across the industry. A low-cost focus strategy would be to provide the lowest cost within an industry segment, that is, for a narrow band of consumers. And a differentiated focus strategy would be to provide a better product or service catered to a particular segment of the industry, so a particular band of consumers. So let's see if we can categorize the competitive strategy of A, Walmart, B, Virgin Airlines, C, a high-end face cream that's uniquely formulated with anti-aging properties targeted at women above the age of 40 and costs about $45 a bottle. Here. And a new line of organic frozen yogurt with relatively low prices. So Walmart, where would we put Walmart's competitive strategy? Well, for the whole industry of supermarkets, Walmart is the low-cost leader. So we could probably say Walmart would fall into this, this category here of competitive strategies. Low-cost leader industry-wide. How about Virgin Airlines? Well, I don't know if you've flown on Virgin Airlines, but it was very catered toward young people. And so in terms of industry-wider focus, probably in this focus group. And in terms of cost or differentiation, it wasn't cheap, but it wasn't very expensive. So this kind of gets at the the idea that this model is not, is never right, but it's only just kind of useful. I'm not sure where we would put Virgin Airlines in terms of cost or differentiation. But if it turned out to be, to be kind of like better, higher end, which I think it kind of sort of was, and it wasn't exactly the cheapest, we could put Virgin Airlines right here. With a differentiated focus strategy. What about C, a high-end face cream? It has anti-aging properties and is targeted at women above the age of 40, and it costs $45 a bottle. So industry-wide or focus? Probably focus, because we know there's a specific demographic being marketed to. And how about cost versus differentiation? Well, $45 is, and we said it's a high-end face cream. That's a differentiated product for a little bottle of face cream. So we can put it there, C as well. Last, let's not forget about D, the relatively inexpensive line of organic frozen yogurt. Well, we said it's relatively inexpensive, so on the cost dimension, we can say, okay, their strategy is low cost. And in terms of industry-wide or focus, well, if we define the market to be frozen treats, then this line of frozen yogurt would be an example of a business that's targeting a subset of consumers. So a focus strategy. Probably what kind of subset of consumers in the frozen treat market is Froyo catering to? Well, frozen yogurt would be probably for people who are health conscious or want to eat, lower fat food, and kind of that kind of band of consumers. So I think it's fair to conclude that this is a low-cost focus strategy business, this relatively inexpensive frozen yogurt line. Once an organization determines their competitive strategy, how does this competitive strategy affect value chain structure? Well, first let's define value chain. A value chain is one or more business processes. These are activities that generate revenue, that is, bring some positive amount of money in for the business, and that is referred to as value. So revenue or value, our book calls it value. The activities also have certain costs. Once you subtract the cost from the value, you have the margin. So now we have three terms, value, cost, and margin, and we can set up an equation. Margin equals value minus cost. Margin, by the way, sometimes is referred to as profit or represented with the pi, so you might see different terms for these concepts. Value you might also see as revenue. But margin equals value minus cost, or profit equals revenue minus cost. Those are very important equations, and so let's go with just calling things margin, value, and cost to be consistent with our textbook. And let's go with this equation, margin equals value minus cost. So just a quick checkpoint. Can you think of an industry with slim margins, so with small margins? And there are lots of examples of these, but one good example is, at the store you can get like a canned thing of vegetables, like canned corn or something. Well, very slim margins on that. In other words, there's not a big difference between how much you're paying for it and how much it costs to produce that particular can of corn. So that product and products like it have slim margins. And kind of the antidote to slim margins is volume. So if we can sell a lot of it, even though we're not making a lot, not making high margins off each particular can of peas, if we can sell a lot of cans of peas, then we'll be able to be profitable. So let's go back to our question number 3. How does competitive strategy determine value chain structure? Well, if the competitive strategy is to be the low-cost leader, then along the way, each value chain activity will try to have the lowest cost possible. So the idea in our equation of margin equals value minus cost is to maximize margins by minimizing cost. What if we have a differentiated competitive strategy? Well, then our equation margin equals value minus cost, we would try to maximize margins by maximizing value. In other words, selling a more expensive product. Here's an example of a value chain, that is, a network of value-creating activities. Each activity, like acquiring bicycle parts or marketing and selling bicycles, has its own margin. And that margin is the difference between the value that the activity generates and its cost. The primary activities in this value chain are acquiring bicycle parts, producing the bicycle, shipping the bicycle, marketing and selling the bicycles, and providing customer service. There are also support activities in this value chain. These are managing supplier relationships, known as procurement, basically getting contracts, investigating new designs, technology, hiring and supporting employees, HR or human resources, and managing company resources, firm infrastructure. These support activities also are part of the value chain and also have their own margins, which are also calculated as the difference between value and cost. The sum of the margins for the primary activities is known as the total margin for primary activities, and the sum of the margin for support activities is known as the total margin for support activities. And these added together are known as the total margin. There are also interactions across value chain activities. These are known as linkages. One example of a linkage is if production is planned based on sales forecasts, and those sales forecasts determine how much raw materials to buy. The value chain consists of 5 primary activities: inbound logistics, receiving the inputs and raw materials from suppliers. Bicycle manufacturer orders, for example, if a bicycle manufacturer orders a bunch of bicycle parts, nuts, bolts, screws, gears, and so on. The second primary activity is operations in manufacturing. That is actually putting the bicycle together. The third primary activity is outbound logistics, shipping or delivering the bicycle to customers. In order to make deals, you have to first find customers. Sales and marketing is the fourth primary activity in the value chain. Finally, it's important to provide support to our bicycle users. The last activity in the value chain is customer service, the last primary activity. Behind the scenes, however, there are certain support activities. These facilitate primary activities, but aren't themselves primary activities. And it's harder to calculate the margin on these. There are 4 support activities of the value chain. 1. Firm infrastructure, finance, accounting, legal affairs. 2. HR, which does recruiting, compensation, evaluation, and training. 3. Technology development. It's research and development and also information systems. And 4. Procurement, making deals with suppliers, contracts, and negotiating prices. A quick study question we can ask ourselves is, what's the difference between procurement and inbound logistics? Let's think in terms of primary and support activities. Well, inbound logistics is one of our primary activities. Procurement happens before inbound logistics and is a support activity. The diagram here summarizes a planning process used by many organizations. In question 4, we'll use this diagram to answer how value chains determine information systems requirements. Let's start on the far left with industry structure. Porter's 5 forces determine the structure of an industry. Next, organizations analyze the structure of their industry based on these 5 forces and use that analysis to formulate a competitive strategy, a long-term plan to be profitable in the industry. Depending on its competitive strategy, an organization will determine its value chains by either maximizing value or minimizing cost, with the equation margin equals value minus cost. The sum of the margins across all value chain activities is known as total margin, or total profit. And it's around this point that we leave off with the new information that we've learned in this chapter and go back to the old information from chapters 1 and 2. Each activity in the value chain will have its own business process, and decisions about the value chain will determine the nature of the business process for each of those activities. And since each business process is designed to help an organization achieve its goals, it will rely, when needed, on the correct information systems to achieve those goals. Our last question is, how do organizations achieve competitive advantages? And there are actually 8 principles of competitive advantages that organizations use. The first is to create a new product or service. For example, you might remember when Google launched Gmail, a new email service. The second is to enhance products or services. For example, you have Pledge and you add a lemon scent to create lemon-scented Pledge. Or you might have noticed enhancements to Facebook over time, another example of this principle of competitive advantage. Organizations can also achieve a competitive advantage by differentiating their products or services, that is, making them more high-end. Here's a picture of Pabst Blue Ribbon marketed to a Chinese market, and you can see that it is being marketed as a very upscale beer. Some principles of competitive advantage, on the other hand, involve implementing new processes. For example, locking in customers and buyers. Well, this is an example of a process where a supplier can really benefit if they lock in customers. For example, if you've signed a multi-year contract with Verizon. What about locking in suppliers? Well, if a coffee farmer has a contract with Starbucks, they're locked in for better or worse. If the price of coffee goes up, then the farmers are kind of at a disadvantage for having been locked into a contract with Starbucks. But if the price of the coffee goes down, then actually they'll be thankful that they signed that contract. Raising barriers to market entry. This is an example of a process implementation that is best demonstrated by the pharmaceutical industry. Maybe not best demonstrated, but certainly evident in the pharmaceutical industry. Barriers to market entry, or patents, I should say, are significant barriers to market entry. So a patent on a new drug like Lipitor it really produces a competitive advantage for the creator of that breakthrough drug. The next principle of competitive advantage is to establish alliances. You might have seen this if you've gone into a FedEx, Kinko's, or another establishment where there's an alliance of multiple organizations. And the last principle of competitive advantage is actually to reduce costs. And one of the ways that this is done oftentimes is through automation or through layoffs.